Just minutes ago, information surfaced about a private mansion connected to Brandon Fugal, a place rarely discussed and never meant to be examined this closely. What began as a routine walkthrough quickly shifted when investigators encountered areas that were never listed, rooms that didn't appear on any plans, and evidence that raised immediate concern. Within moments, access was restricted and recordings were halted. Tonight, we break down what was reportedly found, why it was quietly buried, and what it could mean moving forward. Subscribe now, because stories like this don't stay hidden for long. And once you see what was uncovered, you'll understand why. The mansion tied to Brandon Fugal has always existed in a strange gray area. Publicly, it's described as nothing more than a private residence, another symbol of wealth and success. But those familiar with the property have long suggested that description barely scratches the surface. Unlike most high-end homes, this mansion was designed with layers of separation. Certain wings are isolated from the rest of the structure. Corridors subtly narrow, ceilings shift in height, and materials change in ways that feel deliberate rather than aesthetic. What immediately stands out is how little visual documentation exists. No detailed interior tours, no consistent floor plans. Even real estate records offer only broad outlines, lacking the specifics normally required for a property of this scale. People who have been inside describe a sense that the building wasn't designed to impress guests. It was designed to control movement. Sightlines are limited. Corners feel intentional. Sound behaves oddly in certain hallways, carrying farther than expected in some places and dying completely in others. More unsettling is the timeline. Portions of the mansion appear newer than official construction dates suggest, while other sections seem far older than they should be. Renovations were reportedly carried out in phases, often without public permits, creating internal spaces that don't align with original blueprints. This alone raises questions, but it's the purpose behind these alterations that matters most. Homes are built for living. Facilities are built for function, and this mansion leans heavily toward the latter. Those who reviewed partial layouts noticed entire sections labeled only with internal codes. No names, no descriptions. Rooms without window. Storage areas without visible access points. Even stairwells that appear to lead somewhere but abruptly end behind sealed walls. These aren't accidents, they're choices. And choices like this usually reflect something being protected, studied, or kept out of sight. By the time investigators stepped inside, it was already clear this was not just a residence. It was an environment designed to limit what could be seen, where people could go, and how much they could understand at once. And that realization set the tone for everything that followed. Because if the mansion itself was built to hide something, the real question becomes simple and unsettling. What required this much secrecy in the first place? Entry into the mansion was originally approved under routine circumstances. The visit was framed as controlled, limited, and procedural, with clear boundaries established before anyone stepped inside. Specific rooms were cleared, specific paths were outlined, and specific areas were marked as off-limits, with no expectation that those restrictions would be challenged. At first, everything followed that plan. Doors opened where they were supposed to. Lighting activated normally. Movement was calm, measured, and uneventful. Then, something shifted. Without warning, access systems behaved differently than expected. A secured door responded to credentials that should not have worked. Interior lighting activated in a corridor that was not listed on the access itinerary. According to those present, the change wasn't dramatic at first. It was subtle. A pause, a glance exchanged, the quiet realization that they were standing somewhere they had not been authorized to be. What made this moment disturbing wasn't just the mistake, it was the absence of alarms. No alerts triggered, no automated lockdown followed. Instead, the system allowed continued movement, almost as if the deviation had been anticipated. Those inside later described the feeling as being guided rather than lost, led forward by the structure itself. Hallways narrowed, sound softened. The atmosphere grew noticeably heavier the deeper they went. A Attempts to verify location through internal maps failed. Digital layouts no longer matched physical space. What should have been a short connector hallway extended far longer than expected, ending at a door none of the personnel recognized. This door lacked standard labeling, no warnings, no identifiers, just a reinforced surface and a manual locking mechanism that suggested it was never meant for casual use. It was at this point that protocol began to unravel. Communication slowed, decisions were second-guessed, and an unspoken understanding settled over the group. Whatever lay beyond this point was not part of the original plan, and someone had gone to great lengths to make sure it stayed that way. Beyond the unauthorized door was a room that immediately altered the mood of everyone present. It was not large, but it felt compressed, as if the space resisted being occupied. The walls were bare, unfinished in places, yet intentionally reinforced in others. There were no windows, no obvious ventilation, and no furnishings to suggest comfort or long-term use. The lighting inside did not match the rest of the mansion. It was dimmer, colder, and oddly directional, casting shadows that seemed to bend rather than fall naturally. The first thing noticed was the sound. Voices behaved strangely in this room, carrying too clearly at times, and then vanishing altogether mid-sentence. Footsteps echoed with a delay that didn't match the size of the space. Even small movements felt amplified, while larger sounds seemed swallowed. Several devices began to malfunction almost immediately. Audio equipment produced static. Cameras struggled to maintain focus. One recorder shut off entirely without warning. Temperature readings showed inconsistencies as well. Certain areas of the room were noticeably colder, while others felt unnaturally warm, despite no visible heat source. When handheld sensors were moved through the space, readings spiked and dropped erratically, as if the room itself was interfering with measurement. This was not environmental drift. It was localized and repeatable. What unsettled the group most was the sense that the room was not abandoned. Dust patterns suggested recent activity, yet there were no footprints, no tools, no signs of ongoing work. It appeared maintained without being occupied, preserved rather than used. One individual later described the feeling as standing inside a container rather than a room, something designed to hold more than just people. At that moment, attention shifted from curiosity to caution. This space did not exist by accident. It had been built deliberately, hidden carefully, and separated from the rest of the mansion for a reason. And as the group stood there in silence, one thought became impossible to ignore. If this room was meant to stay unseen, then simply entering it may have already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Once the room was documented, attention shifted to what was stored within it. These were not decorative items, nor were they consistent with anything found elsewhere in the mansion. Along the walls sat containers made from mixed materials, some metallic, others composite, each sealed and unmarked. No labels, no serial numbers, nothing that suggested public manufacture or consumer use. Whatever these objects were, they had been intentionally stripped of identity. Several items appeared to be tools, but their design didn't align with conventional purposes. Edges were smoothed where grip would normally be unnecessary. Weight distribution felt unbalanced in ways that made handling awkward. A few pieces emitted a faint hum when lifted, subtle enough to be dismissed at first, yet impossible to ignore once noticed. None of the items were powered, yet they behaved as if energy was present. More troubling was the condition of the storage itself. Everything was clean, not unused, but maintained. No corrosion, no dust buildup on the containers themselves. The surrounding floor showed signs of careful movement, as though items had been repositioned recently, then returned to precise locations. This wasn't forgotten storage. It was active without witnesses. Attempts to photograph certain objects resulted in distortion. Images appeared blurred or slightly offset, even when taken from close range. One device refused to save files altogether while pointed toward a specific container. When the lens was moved away, normal function returned. That behavior was repeated more than once. At this stage, the assumption that these were harmless materials collapsed. These objects served a purpose, and that purpose required privacy. They weren't trophies. They weren't collected curiosities. They were part of a process. And standing in that room, surrounded by items that resisted documentation, one conclusion became unavoidable. Whatever was happening inside this mansion was not meant to be explained. It was meant to continue uninterrupted. Once attention turned to documentation, the atmosphere inside the mansion shifted again. Cameras that had been operating without issue began to malfunction. One by one, recording devices stopped capturing usable data. Some powered down unexpectedly. Others continued running, but produced files that were either corrupted or completely empty when reviewed. At first, this was treated as technical failure. That explanation did not hold for long. Audio logs were the first to disappear. Timestamps remained, but the sound itself was gone, replaced by low static or silence. Video files showed brief moments of clarity before degrading into distortion. In several cases, recordings ended seconds before something came into frame, as if cut intentionally. No one recalled pressing stop. No commands were given. The footage simply ended. Shortly after, instructions were issued. Documentation was to pause. Certain areas were no longer to be filmed at all. Devices already used inside the restricted sections were collected and set aside, supposedly for review. Those devices were never returned in their original condition. Memory cards were wiped. Internal logs were missing. Even metadata had been altered in ways that suggested deliberate removal rather than system error. What stood out most was how quickly this response occurred. There was no confusion, no debate, no attempt to troubleshoot on site. The decision to restrict footage came immediately, as though the possibility had already been anticipated. Those present understood the message without it being stated directly. Whatever had been captured was not meant to exist outside that building. Later, when partial material surfaced, it was heavily edited. Transitions were abrupt. Key moments were absent. Context was removed. What remained felt sanitized, stripped of the very details that would explain why recording had been halted in the first place. At that point, it became clear that the most disturbing discovery was not a room or an object, but the reaction itself. You do not erase evidence unless it threatens something, and once footage is taken away, the story no longer belongs to those who witnessed it. As details from the mansion were quietly contained, attention turned to something harder to dismiss. The structure, the restrictions, and the response did not exist in isolation. Similar elements had appeared before, at locations connected to Brandon Fugal, each time following the same trajectory. Initial curiosity, limited access, anomalies that resisted explanation, then silence. Architectural features overlapped in troubling ways, reinforced interior spaces, inconsistent layouts, rooms excluded from public records. At each site, witnesses described a shift in tone once certain thresholds were crossed, as if permission itself had layers. Even the language used afterward remained consistent. Nothing unusual, no threat, no reason for concern. Statements that explained nothing while closing every door. What made this connection unsettling was repetition. One unusual property can be dismissed as coincidence. Two can be argued as bad luck. But multiple locations sharing the same design philosophy and the same pattern of restricted discovery suggest intention. Someone was not reacting to events as they occurred. They were responding according to a plan already in place. When timelines were compared, another detail emerged. Each incident followed a similar sequence of escalation, then containment, access granted, then narrowed, documentation allowed, then revoked. Individuals involved became quieter over time, their public remarks increasingly vague. No single event stood out as the breaking point, because the breaking point was built into the process. This realization reframed the mansion entirely. It was not the origin of something disturbing. It was one node in a larger network of controlled spaces, each designed to reveal only what was necessary, and only to the right people. The mansion did not raise new questions. It confirmed old ones that had never been answered. At that stage, the investigation stopped being about what was found inside a building. It became about why the same discoveries kept happening in different places, under different circumstances, yet always ended the same way, quietly, deliberately, and without explanation. When those involved finally exited the mansion, the effects did not end at the gate. In the hours that followed, behavior began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. Conversations became shorter. Messages went unanswered. Individuals who had been vocal during the visit suddenly avoided specifics, speaking only in general terms or declining to comment altogether. No one argued. No one protested. Silence silence settled naturally, as if it had been agreed upon without words. In public settings, the shift was even more apparent. Interviews that had been scheduled were quietly postponed. When questions were asked, responses were careful and controlled, stripped of emotion and detail. Body language betrayed unease. Eyes drifted, hands tightened. The confidence seen earlier was gone, replaced by restraint. Whatever had been encountered inside the mansion lingered, shaping reactions long after the physical distance grew. Privately, some participants reportedly requested to be removed from future involvement altogether. Others asked for reassignment away from similar environments. These were not dramatic exits. They were quiet withdrawals, framed as personal decisions or scheduling conflicts. Yet the timing was impossible to ignore. The mansion had been left behind, but its influence had not. What made these reactions troubling was their consistency. Different individuals, different roles, same response. No one contradicted the official narrative, yet no one reinforced it either. The absence of denial spoke louder than confirmation ever could. It suggested that speaking plainly carried consequences no one was willing to risk. By the time days passed, patterns hardened. Phones stayed silent. Statements stayed vague. No follow-ups came. The event was treated as concluded, yet no one acted relieved. The absence of closure became its own answer, hinting that what was seen could not be undone, ever. In the days that followed, the absence of explanation became impossible to ignore. No official statement clarified what had happened inside the mansion. No denial was issued. No confirmation was offered. Instead, there was a careful redirection of attention, a subtle shift away from specifics and toward broader, less threatening topics. Questions were acknowledged without being answered. The event was neither acknowledged nor disputed. It simply faded from public discussion. This type of response is rarely accidental. When something is harmless, it is dismissed openly. When something is misunderstood, it is explained. Silence, on the other hand, is reserved for situations where explanation creates more risk than secrecy. Addressing the discovery directly would have required acknowledging inconsistencies, missing footage, and restricted access, details that raise more questions than they resolve. What stood out most was how coordinated the silence appeared. Different voices, different platforms, same outcome. No leaks, no contradictions, no attempt to control the narrative aggressively, just a collective decision to let it dissolve. That restraint suggested confidence, not confusion, as if those responsible knew that time alone would bury the issue more effectively than confrontation ever could. Behind closed doors, conversations reportedly continued, but none reached the public. The absence of even vague reassurance hinted that reassurance was not possible. Any explanation would have required admitting that something unexpected had been encountered, something that could not be neatly categorized or safely discussed. So instead, the story was allowed to remain unfinished. This refusal to address the discovery directly did not calm suspicion, it intensified it. Silence created space for interpretation, and that space grew larger with every unanswered question. The lack of closure became the most revealing detail of all, because when those in control choose not to speak, it is often because the truth does not belong to them alone, and once spoken, it cannot be contained again. When the mansion finally fell quiet, the most important detail was not what had been found, but what followed. The absence of explanation, the removal of evidence, and the coordinated silence all pointed toward a single conclusion. This discovery was not an anomaly, it was confirmation. Whatever existed inside that mansion was already understood by those in control, and exposure was the real threat. Viewed this way, every decision makes sense. Restricted access was not about safety, it was about containment. Missing footage was not accidental loss, it was deliberate protection. Silence was not confusion, it was strategy. The mansion functioned as a checkpoint, a place where something ongoing could be observed, stored, or managed without public interference. This reframes the entire narrative. The mansion was never meant to shock the public because it was never meant to be seen at all. It was designed to operate quietly, indefinitely, to exist without explanation, and to remain effective as long as curiosity stayed outside its walls. Once attention reached inside, the system responded exactly as it was built to. The unsettling truth is that nothing ended when the doors closed. Whatever process was underway did not stop. It simply moved beyond view again. The reaction was not damage control. It was maintenance. And that distinction matters because maintenance implies continuity. If this discovery teaches anything, it is that secrecy is not always about hiding danger. Sometimes it is about preserving function. Some environments are hidden not because they are unstable, but because they are working exactly as intended. And that leaves one final question lingering in the silence. If this was only one location, carefully managed and swiftly contained, how many others exist that have never been questioned at all? That possibility, once considered, makes the discovery feel far less isolated. Indeed,